The CS for the National Treasury was in Parliament yesterday, James. I'm sure somebody who is a CEO of the Institute of Public Finance Kenya cannot have been doing anything else the whole of yesterday afternoon other than just looking and listening to what the CS is saying. So you picked at a lot of things. Some wins, some gains, some misses, some areas which are still grey, and in fact those ones are the ones we'll be interested in to hear. And we're looking at what people are, saying. For example, removal of VAT and excise duty on locally manufactured vehicles. That's going to make the Laikipia. You see the Laikipia cars? Mm-hmm. Now they'll be cheap.
Okay.
We're all going to Laikipia to buy our next vehicle.
Your next vehicle?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you say, James?
Well, thank you. Interesting conversation happening today, and of course, based on yesterday, what happened yesterday, it happened yesterday in Parliament. But from where we sit as an institute, we feel, based on the experience that the Jubilee government has had, they failed to shape the conversation of the next 10 years of the next governments that will come, because it's just the usual, increase the budget and do not say where the money is coming from, apart from borrowing. And that's one thing. So, and first of all, we're still in a conversation where we expanded, again, our spending, which is the biggest problem we have, because we don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. So that's where we start from. So we have not helped to shape the next government that comes into place. And of course, they limit the extent to which the next government can wiggle, because the next government comes in and they can work with supplementary budget up to a certain point, meaning they are bound by decisions that will be made by this particular parliament and government.
Now that you've brought, I wanted to ask that question, Uko, towards the end of the show, but let me just ask it now. Does it make sense? Okay, so our budget process is guided by the Constitution and the Public Finance Management Act, right? Yeah. So budget must be read at a certain point. And also we've got the East African protocols where we all have to harmonize the reading of our budget and all. Does it make sense for a transition government to be presenting an annual budget when they're not going to implement even 2 months of it?
Well, that's a difficult policy question to ask, because the government exists in perpetuity. So it's specific actors within the space that are exiting, but the civil service continues to run. So we are looking at that continuity element, that we could have a prolonged, contested elections, but the government still needs to learn to a greater extent.
That's true. But the new administration comes in with its own priority areas and its own policies. Yeah. So, for example, Ukur Yatani, representing the Uhuru Ruto administration, is presenting what the Uhuru Ruto administration has been doing and saying we still want to continue with the Big Four agenda, putting money in the Big Four projects and enablers and all. New administration comes in and they have their different priorities. So you're most likely going to have a supplementary budget before the end of the year that starts looking at things differently. Another supplementary budget by the end of the first quarter of next year that starts shifting things differently. So what was presented by Ukur Yatani today ends up looking like a different animal by March next year.
Well, that's very true. It will look from that perspective, but also taking into consideration that the government is in the process of developing the medium-term plan, the MTP4, which I think it's going up for public participation and consultations. I think sometimes in this April and May or thereabout. So, and of course, it takes the programs that are being proposed across, trying to look at it. But ultimately, the government that comes into office has to do its own supplementary budgets and look at what is in it. And that's the radical shift that will be there. But they are also bound. That's why I say the limitation of the decision by this government is that the incoming government is limited to an extent of, really of max like 10% of the 3.3 trillion budget we are talking about.
James, so much was said yesterday, the reading of the budget. But what did you hear?
What did I hear? Did I hear anything, Lily? But well, to say the truth is, I look at the budget that, first of all, failed to recognize, that we need to strengthen the institutions that support the citizens. I looked, for example, the propositions. First of all, this, it's an ambush by the National Treasury and the CS for that matter, because we had not seen, for example, the program-based budget that he was leading the statement. Ideally, he should have said, released the budgets, the program-based budget before the speech, so that also citizens have an opportunity to look at what is, before this, the speech. So you have Parliament that's been allocated 50 billion, for example, and the judicial that's been allocated 18 billion. But given an option, that's why I said I'm wondering what I really had, because the biggest struggle we've had, is the allocation to the judicial, for example. And but there was, of course, a good win for the judicial, because he acknowledged that we are at a point where we've activated the Judiciary Fund, so that resources can, for judiciary can be safeguarded. But still, the allocation is not proportionate to the work the judiciary is doing, for example. And of course, the amount of money allocated to the Office of the Auditor General, the type of work we do looking at transparency and accountability of resources by government, is we want to see oversight institutions being provided with more resources. So that's the way I looked at it and asking. So Parliament, you allocate Parliament 50 billion, well and good. But remember that 50 billion is, you still have an extra some 44 billion or 48 billion that goes to CDF under the Ministry of State, State Department, of Planning. So in this sense, you have another controlled kitty of another 50 billion, 100 billion, So that's, that's a question. And of course, also asking, how much have we, in this budget with regards to jump-starting our economy, because we're still coming out of COVID effects. We are not yet out of COVID as a pandemic, but the effects of the pandemic are still with us. So we've not triggered, for example, the private sector engagement, because the government, you look at what they have allocated the micro and small enterprises. Yes, we are saying that border borders, for example, which is a huge economy on its own, we're going to ask them to pick up their insurances, but also asking what incentives are you providing to that particular segment of the micro and small enterprises, MSMEs, themselves.
If I can jump in, James, but last year, same CS told us that the budget that was being read was an economic stimulating budget. This is what he said, using the same words, coming off the cuff of COVID-19 and saying, look, we've been in the doldrums. Now this budget that I'm delivering to you is one that is going to lift us out of that one. He said the same thing yesterday and said, okay, now we're looking at a budget that is going to continue with this economic stimulation. Are you saying that if you did an audit, mental audit of what happened after the budget 2021, and then 2021, 2022, and now what we're seeing 2022, 2023, have we not seen that economic stimulation?
It's difficult. When you have the policeman as the judge, the prosecutor, and the policeman themselves, whatever they say is law. And that's a difficult thing we have, for example, with the National Treasury, because they determine the resources that goes where they go, they check on accountability, and they decide on planning. So the National Treasury itself, what they say out ends up being, like the gospel truth to everyone. What potentially, come to think about it, there is the government, the National Treasury has not done proper triggers in the the economy. For example, we talked about the credit. One thing I would have expected to talk about strongly about the credit guarantee scheme. Of course, I saw saying we'll allocate some 3 billion, but what we allocated previously triggered some extra 12 billion. But I want you to check, for example, the 12 billion went to who? Because that's what for us to see how whether the economy really triggered something, we would be asking this 12 billion that we're saying that was triggered from the 3 billion we released last year. Who are the beneficiaries of the 12 billion? Because it could still be the bigger macro, but
the MEs.
Exactly. But you see, you look at where the employment is in the country, is the SMEs. We're asking, what are the conditions, and are we still giving access to credit guarantee via the light mechanisms? If, for example, we are saying digital lenders have taken many people to poverty, and you want to give access to that credit guarantee, potentially then businesses need to access money through digital lenders, work with digital lenders instead of working with mainstream banking. Because what happens is that you give them 3 billion and they said that 2 billion to you via boards. They buy boards from you, So they're still making more money from you, thinking that you are triggering. Then they use that. So from last year, based on that statement, that we are, the economy is, moving from where we are, I would think not much has happened. Of course, the numbers say, and you can see, really, I think more people are in poverty than they were in 2019, come to think about it. Because we need to link these resources with the people, how the quality of life has improved. It's not about numbers alone. It's about how the quality of life has improved and, and the amount. And the thing is, unfortunately, the biggest problem here, we are excited by how bigger the budget becomes. Yep. It's not what the budget does. It's how bigger every year the budget, gets.
And in fact, on that issue, bigger budget, there's some messaging around. Well, we've been bringing down the deficit, but it's still a sizable deficit, which means taxation, remains pretty high. What's your thought about the tax measures that were introduced, or the tax position that was taken?
So, yesterday, tax measures, there were no deliberate tax measures that I would say that were very significant, apart, for example, looking at, nicotine products, alcohol advertisement and gambling, such, around what, it's just a way, an indirect way of going through the sin taxes, what they call this, we call the sin taxes. But this, general taxes, of course, all of us, we need to have those taxes being paid. But what we also need to think about is the tax expenditures being provided. Very good. We are saying that, we're going to exempt, VAT from manufacturing of cars. But that's a tax expenditure in the first place. It's a foregone tax. We want to encourage more, more passenger vehicles. But of course, we are not able to control what we have to provide the proper light infrastructure. So, you take away that tax, because you need to be commensurate. It needs to be a reward to the manufacturers that if the production plant of this passenger vehicle is employing 100 Kenyans, then that's exactly what we're going to exempt, recover. Not just a blanket tax exemption, because then if you look at studies, tax exemption is not a prerequisite for me to establish business in a country. I'm more interested in a proper, sound environment, politically, economically, zero interference from government, for example. That would encourage me to come. And I'm willing to pay my taxes. But when you think about that, you're putting tax, tax measures, relief, that element so that I can invest, it's counterproductive to the economy. That's why I didn't find proper sound tax measures being provided to trigger, the economy.
What would you have wanted? What should Kenyans have expected, or what should Kenyans demand as it goes through the is it the appropriation process, the deliberations in Parliament, with regard to cost of living and taxes?
So, when you think about what now, the ball is in Parliament's court, because documents have been tabled, and Parliament, first of all, we need to come from where in March. So, recognize that this budget between March and April, the proposed budget has increased by around 32 billion in a month's time. Because what Parliament approved was around 3.04 billion. Now we have 3.34 billion, now 32 billion. So we're asking where. So you see, the problem is not actually tax or anything. It's our large appetite for expenditure and spending. And so Parliament has a big responsibility, first of all, to cushion Kenyans via the finance bill. So we are looking at, when we think about, the question is around expanding the tax base. Who is in the bracket, and who is not in the bracket. Now, what you find KRA doing is going, instead of going wide, they are going deeper. The person who's paying tax is the person we are going, because you're already in the system. So ideally what would happen is, everyone needs to pay their fair share of taxes, and those propositions, including, for example, we used to have, I think like when they brought on board matatu drivers, the conductors, bring the border borders into play, and for example, border borders pay a lot of taxes because in every liter of fuel they put in their border, there is tax component. Now you can imagine the border borders in this country. It's a segment, but of course also recognize that, as a huge taxpayer, there's no way KRA will ever call border as a large taxpayer organization. They'll call the large multinationals, in this country. And I think that's one thing that we recognize, because you also incentivize people to pay taxes. So we need to figure out and say, if this segment of the society, the amount of taxes they are paying, we need to see those taxes, acknowledge to them that this amount of taxes are doing this productively. Then we come and say, we want to expand this tax base. Have conversations with citizens. Who is paying taxes? Who is not paying taxes? How are they? The mop-up, for example, that KRA has been doing. Of course, we've seen KRA tax base, increasing. But the question is it new taxes, or are we reclaiming the previous taxes and saying the economy is growing? That's a question. And after we finish mopping up, what happens? Does it will mean that our taxes reduce? And the question that Wajiro has asked, what should citizens expect now from a parliament, for example, is parliament looking, for example, are we is everyone, for example, paying their fair share of tax? And we have an amazing, and probably our parliament needs to start listening more to the parliament budget office. Our politicians, they need to listen to those technical guys, because the reports coming out, from parliament budget office, are great reports. But between the generation of those reports and policy making, something is getting lost in between there. And that's where we need to look. So parliament in its own needs to look at our manufacturing. How do we incentivize our manufacturers? We don't necessarily have to give them tax breaks, for example, because we need the taxes, but we need to give them an assurance that the environment under which you're operating, it's, the government, is going to improve. And of course, this also means that the other thing is we need to see full transfer of functions, county functions. So why do we have a water ministry in Nairobi, for example? Why do we have agriculture and irrigation in Nairobi? If you were to set those functions to counties properly, it would mean there would be more money at the county, and that monitoring of those irrigations component and water and agriculture would be more closer. And then we can empower the regulatory institutions, the policy institutions in Nairobi. Then they will ensure that there is value for money. And that's what would trigger, for example, increased quality of life and reduced cost of living for citizens.
And rationalize the budget.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Definitely.
Let's take a break. 29 minutes after 8, Kenya's biggest conversation. We are talking about budget 2022-2023, the hits and the misses. James Muraguri, the CEO of the Institute of Public Finance Kenya, is with us in the studio. He was following that budget speech. He's telling us what he heard, what he didn't hear, what he would have wanted to hear, what we should look out for in terms of what should our members of parliament then tell us, what we should expect from the finance bill, and what should our finance committee of the National Assembly actually concentrate and focus on. Conversation continues right after this break. We are live on KTN Home, on SpiceFM, and on YouTube and Facebook. Good morning.
This is the Situation Room.
The Situation Room, Kenya's biggest conversation. Brought to you by Colgate.
Thank you.
The political class, the contestants, everybody is trying to outsteal the other.
Remorse is not taught in any school. Manners is something you get from your mother. You don't get it from your political party.
Why are we so unfocused as a country? Why are we spending money and resources, yet we have real challenges in this country?
This coronavirus pandemic should teach us one thing, that universal healthcare is critical. Because at this point, whether you have a medical card that covers you, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your
18
day.
degrees, 19 degrees, and cloudy in Nairobi.
Eric Latif, Nduoko, Wajiro Gekonyo, and James Muraguri from the Institute of Public Finance Kenya talking about the budget. This is President Uhuru Kenyatta's farewell budget. Ukur Yatani presented it in Parliament yesterday. Some of these key highlights. The budget itself is 3.34 trillion selling, hoping to raise revenues of 2.44 trillion and financing a deficit of 862 billion shillings. Now look at the allocations. So the counties are going to get 407 billion shillings county allocation, including the equitable share and the conditional allocations. Education gets 513 billion shillings, which is more than all the counties get for all the functions of the devolution combined. If you look then at what James, you were saying, there are some functions that are devolved, but the national government is still allocating money at national level for. So, for example, the Big Four agenda, there's some 46 billion shillings that's going to enhancing food and nutrition security to all Kenyans. That's what? Agriculture. It's devolved. There's some 62 billion shillings that's going to providing universal health coverage to guarantee quality and affordable healthcare to all Kenyans. That's health. It's devolved. So if you look at how much devolution has gotten for all the functions and running and recurrent expenditure at devolved units, and then how much the others are getting at national level, there's a huge disconnect. Why is there such a disconnect, James?
I think the disconnect is as a result of vested interests. We're not willing to let those functions go to the counties because it's also a way of rewarding political patronage. And I think that's the biggest undoing we have as a country. We don't see, we work with the next election in mind instead of the next generation. The current generation of politicians would want to think they're thinking about the next elections instead of thinking they need to live to have a better country for their children. I mean, if I was the president, I would wish if my children would be presidents in this country to find a better country that I ruled well. And that's the biggest problem that we have. And that's why we need to have, whichever government comes into power in the next 5 months or so, they need to be committed to devolution properly and devolve those functions. Let counties learn, and let's put counties to account. I think today, if you were to, if you wanted Kenyans to stone you, is to touch devolution, remove counties, even a single county, because we've seen the impact of counties. You walk into hitherto, unopened places, and at least there's a Malam Road that you can access. So you think about the amount of money, and you've mentioned about 4 or 7 billion to counties. Actually, compared to the national government, the actual commitments from our taxes, it's around 370 billion, because the other money on top is conditional grants and, from partners. And 370 billion is what we've been giving counties for the last 3 years now, or thereabout. And not even 3 years, 5 years, because it was part of the conditional grants. Remember, we converted money, for example, Mombasa PGH, the level 5 hospital, used to receive a conditional grant that is no longer receiving, but still have to serve all those counties, in those areas. So the money to counties has not increased for the last 4 or 5 years. But the value of Kenya shilling has also lost its value to inflation has counted. So there's not been, this government has not been committed to devolution. Let's be very honest. The commitment to devolution has not been real, and I think they are only working towards a bare minimum. Because, if you come to think about it, we are actually using the 2017-2018 audited accounts to make a decision on that. So we have at least closer. We have 2018-2019 and 2019-2020 to make a decision on the amount of money. And they're not pushing through Parliament so that, because if Parliament approves, it means you have to make that decision on how much money goes to county. So the 370 billion would be a drop. It will actually, the percentage would close. Now we are talking about 27% of the 2017-2018, if I'm not wrong. So if you see 27%, but if you come to 2019-2020, that would come to probably 22-20%.
It keeps dropping.
Exactly.
The national budget is bigger.
Exactly. That's it. So that commitment lacks. And of course, it has a direct impact to the cost of living and quality of life for citizens.
Yeah. Can I ask about the sectoral education? What's your take on this quite large allocation? It looks like it's important. It is important to invest in human capital. I think there is a big drive on the continent to do that. Does this look like it's aligned to that? And then also security this budget has been going up. And we were at a forum on Tuesday where one of our colleagues asked, is Kenya planning to go to war with Russia? Why are they, what's happening with security? Yeah, so what's happening with these two sectors?
Well, education, if you look at the 513 billion, for example, allocated to education, to a greater extent is the salaries, the TSC budget. That's a huge component, of it. And of course, there has also been a bigger drive because of supporting the establishment of the CBC junior secondary schools. Yeah. So we are putting a little bit of more money on that. But traditionally, the education sector has taken a huge chunk of our budget because it's heavily a human resource driven sector. And of course, the same with security. Security, globally, all the budgets globally for security, tend to go up because because it's also the most opaque in terms of accountability. So no one asks the question, you know. And of course, you know, all of us, you know, I'm happy when I see a police Land Rover drive ahead of me, even if it has one policeman. It's a form of assurance that there's security, you know. And but the biggest problem is the level of accountability with those resources. And all of us as citizens, we understand it's important to fund our security services, but what we continuously call is, you know, it's accountability. Because, and of course, we saw, you know, the easiest way to steal public money is through the security contracts, like agro-leasing. You know, that whole element was through the security contracts and that. But, well, I don't think there is anyone intending to go to war, you know, with Kenya anytime soon. Our budget is pretty good, and we hope that's been directed to get the ammunition required to safeguard our space as a country.
Should be internal.
not to private pockets.
Exactly. Yeah. But the unfortunate thing is that you found also our beefing up of security is also procurement to suppress independent voices internally. You know, I mean, we saw a young man demonstrating on the cost of living, you know, yesterday. I mean, really. And the way he was handled, I mean, really, you know.
What are you saying?
And of course, you see,
he paid a price for living.
Exactly. Of course, and of course, you see, you know, my most disappointing thing is seeing a convoy driving from Treasury to Parliament with security. I mean, really, with a briefcase, papers being guarded because there's no money. You know, if there was money, we could say yes.
That was a bad show.
Absolutely.
That for Ukuri Atani, I'm sure you're watching this, and everybody else at the National Treasury. That was a bad show.
It was.
You did not have to have so many security officers, and yet there were no demonstrators even on the road. Yeah. Many security officers. In fact, you're even wondering. So they're even punting. Why are they running?
Sure.
It's just a walk from the National Treasury to Parliament buildings. That's sufficient. But
in fact, James, this is a space we need to reclaim. That we need to make sure on budget day citizens are on the streets, because really this is maybe one of the pinnacle points in the financial year. We know the budget process starts much earlier, but we need to reclaim that space in terms of demonstrations and being seen, so that we get into the culture of our public officers realizing that briefcase represents my money and my interests.
Yeah.
And how much I'm going to be taxed going forward. Yeah. James, I want to still stick on the question that Wanjiru had asked on the huge allocation to education. Since 2003, when Kibaki government came and said, let all children go to school, we have seen huge allocation of budget to education. But we are in 2022, and we are talking about a stimulus to the education sector to build classrooms. And the education CS asking the private sector, please build classrooms so that we can accommodate the new CBC classrooms. Have we been spending the money the right way on education? You've talked about, yes, a lot of it has gone into, you know, hiring teachers, getting teachers. We still don't have a good ratio of teacher to pupils. But on infrastructure development, there is money that comes from the national government. There is money that comes from CDF. We are still talking about bursaries supporting the education sector. CDF has a ring-fenced bursary fund. The National Government Education Ministry has a ring-fenced bursary fund. Counties have ring-fenced bursary funds. The Presidential Bursary Fund. Yeah. And yet it's the highest in our... Are we spending this money well?
Absolutely. We are not spending the money well, because the biggest problem we have is our planning, our prioritization. So you'll find that 513 billion, take the TSC budget of probably approximately 300 billion or thereabout, then the capitation grants that need to go to respective schools. So actually the amount of money left for development is extremely very minimal. But also take into consideration, yes, it's not minimal because we're talking probably around 100 billion or thereabout.
That is not a small amount of money.
It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money in this economy. The problem is the prioritization on that, and of course, budgeted corruption. You know, we cannot rule out budgeted corruption in those, in the contracting business, because the people who are being, who are constructing those classrooms have to factor in kickbacks, and it's open in this economy. You know, we've got, the 10%. That our 3.3 trillion budget, just to be assured, around 300 billion.
Some 10%.
Some 10% of it is
unaccounted for.
Yeah. It's petty cash to grease hearts here and there, and it's the most unfortunate thing, and that's the biggest problem we have. In that 513 billion, you essentially find approximately the budget we need there is 400 billion. It's not 513. So our planning and prioritization then becomes the challenge we are asking for, because then again, we also have, for example, the CDF. And thanks to Ajiro and others who've been on this work for long, and having even the CDF get structured properly to move from Parliament to State Department, because we ultimately need to see CDF moving from being controlled politically to being a proper planning process of the CDF.
CDF should be scrapped.
Absolutely, it should, so that we focus. It's a form of bribery to politicians, so that they can always bid on behalf of the executive.
Unfortunately, there's a perverse interest that plays in every time, and that's where you say this 100 billion that goes to Parliament de facto. And
Judiciary Fund, James.
Yeah.
So yesterday the CS said, finally, after so many years, we have framework in place that now we can set up the Judiciary Fund, and money is going into the Judiciary Fund. The judiciary will now be controlling its own budget. But you said, look at how much is going to the judiciary, an arm of government that should have presence across the country, and look at how much is going to Parliament. That is headquartered in Nairobi. The National Assembly only sits in Nairobi, and members of Parliament occasionally go to their constituencies. Should we have seen more allocation to the Judiciary Fund?
And can I just add on that? How do we deal with self-interest in the budget-making powers of Parliament?
So first of all, when you're talking about this, the self-interests, we have not seen the breakdown of the Parliament budget itself, the 50 billion. So we just have a lump sum of 50 billion that's going to Parliament. But you'll find that the 18 billion for judiciary, the judiciary has been pretty open, and they have even called for public participation on their budget, on the budget for this. On average, the minimum we should be talking about, as Malaga had asked, it's 2.5% of the overall budget. We should be talking that we've allocated judicial at least 75 billion Kenya shillings this year. And I think this is a campaign that citizens need to sustain, because all of us, our last line of defense is our judiciary. If we have a strong judiciary, if we have courts across each constituency, then when you're seeking justice, the cost of seeking justice is lower. Justice is accessible to everyone, because if the court is, if you're in Galisa and the next court available is in Isiolo, you'll say, I don't care about that justice. You'll give up. You'll give up on that. So that, we need to be deliberate as citizens. And for those who are working, in the space, it's a conversation that needs to continue. But the question we need to ask is, are we deliberate, First of all, the self-interest comes also because, like I said, you have a treasury that's the judge, the police, and the prosecutor. So they make decisions on the money and everything. But we need to, first of all, remove the powers of the National Treasury to plan the budget and take it to the office of the president, specifically office of the president, like, have an office of management and budget, where those decisions, because this is a president's question. The quality of life for citizens, it's a president's question. He cannot run away from it. Life gets chaotic for citizens, it is the buck stops with the president, right? So that we are left with Treasury to help the president in accounting and saying, we are reporting that we've checked, and the ministries, we are consolidating the reports, but you can't be the one planning. So who allocates money for National Treasury? Because it allocates money for everyone. Who allocates money to the National Treasury? Right? And so that's why you find there are consistent items. For example, every year, 5 billion for IFMIS, re-engineering, reinventing. And they're not bad things. But the question is, no one, because they also have to make a decision on the money that goes to the Office of the Auditor General.
Okay.
You see. And we want to take, for example, for Parliament to make a stronger case for the Office of the Auditor General so that it is properly delinked from National Treasury. We know these institutions have to work together, including the controller of budget, for example. But we want to see more resources on those oversight institutions and not be dependent on the National Treasury.
James, we're looking at processes. We're looking at a pre-budget process months in advance before we even saw what happened yesterday. Yesterday was just like the cherry on top. All of this had taken place before. Then we see the actual implementation of budget lines, the money being released, spent. Thereafter, at the end of the fiscal year, I'm only assuming then that you should then see a recap of all of these things that have happened. Because now it's pertinent to some of the issues that you raise. Who then is responsible? Obviously, we know that it is Parliament to tell us these are the lines that have been drawn, and this is where the money was spent. This is how it was absorbed or not. But it would appear as though there's a shoddy job that has been done of that in the recent past. But then how then important would it be to help get out of some of these problems that we are seeing today, whereby you have a budget of 3.3 trillion. You know that certain things have not been done. It is clear, it is evident that they had said was going to happen. How would a thorough audit, monitoring, evaluation of the budget help to solve some of these issues that you're talking about?
So, thank you. If you think about it, we have a mechanism of reporting for the budget. For example, the 2021-2022 budget, we already have the two quarters report up to December. The challenge we have, and of course, because of the nature of our budget making cycle, it's not possible to have a full year 2021, 2022, for example, in June. You can only have like 3 quarters. But what has happened over the years is the quality of information contained in those reports. So as a citizen, I'm not able to do. So I'll get a sectoral consolidated report for the State Department of Health, right? And I don't have the State Department of Health comprehensive report. So Treasury gives us a 70-page report of spending 1.2 trillion, 1.3 trillion. That is very high level. It's policy. Potentially, as a citizen, I want to drill down to the Ministry of Agriculture. So what we should be asking, for example, in some of these conditions is, for example, for Parliament to demand comprehensive annexes to that 70-page document. Because you present to Parliament a 70-page document, they'll interrogate it based on lines, one single line. State Department for Agriculture, 70 billion. But what did 70 billion do? That's where the biggest problem is. And one thing, as you said, is, in our open budget survey result for 2019, the biggest problem we have, as you said, it's Parliament, because there's no oversight during budget implementation. We'll only discuss this when the Auditor General releases a report or the Controller of Budget releases a report. At least the Controller of Budget report is more comprehensive than what National Treasury releases. But we need to see Parliament as citizen representative helping us get that conversation. We will demand, as players in the sector, ourselves at the Institute, Wanjiro and TISA community, trying to demand for those, but we'll go up to a certain point. But we want to see the quality of information contained in those reports increasing and improving.
Does Parliament have the capacity to interrogate those? I'm asking that against the backdrop of a conversation that we had here with, I don't know whether he's still the chair or he's a former chair of the Accounts Committee.
They have 50 billion shillings. What
No.
does capacity
mean? By
mean?
capacity, I mean, the members of Parliament, for example, they say, we are looking at the Auditor General's report and we have to interrogate all this. We have to, everybody who's been mentioned here, we've got to call them, we've got to question them, then we've got to prepare a report. And you're saying we actually have such a serious backlog. Now imagine if every quarter Parliament is also then expected to interrogate the expenditure of the budget. Before the quarter is over, the next quarter report has come in. Do they have the capacity to do that? And what do they need so that they can actually be efficient and to dig deep into these reports that come before Parliament? And imagine if it was actually coming item per item. This is the health ministry. X amount of money went here. This other amount of money went here. For them now to confirm that this amount of money went there.
And what do they do with the 50 billion?
Their job is to do exactly that. If they don't have capacity, they get it. That's why we pay them as citizens. Right? We have to start from there. So if you're saying that you have backlogs, you're asking yourself, why do we have backlogs? We need to clear this. And like judicial, for example, we say we have backlogs in terms of cases because we don't have money to hire judges. Parliament has those powers to allocate money to themselves, unlike judiciary. Right? So when we talk about that backlog, is a result of their unwillingness to move that extra step. Because we see, for example, if that's, for example, is a Public Accounts Committee that looks at the audit report, compare that with the budget, the time between now and the next 1 week, based on what was presented yesterday, I'm telling you, you'll find a comprehensive report from the Parliamentary Budget Office, and which sits as the clerk to the Budget Committee. The effectiveness of that particular office. And that's why I was saying there's a disconnect between what they produce and what the politicians at the floor of the House do. And that's the link that needs to be worked on. So the Public Accounts Committee need to ask ourselves, where is the disconnect between the backlog we have? But of course, first of all, whatever they work on and the report they get in, and we client also the Office of the Auditor General, is that there needs to be a managerial responsibility in those accounts. You see, for example, because you'll find and say the State Department of Health, the PS did And so whoever the PS also comes is, will also, because we are dealing with the office of the PS. We are not dealing with an individual. We need to individualize these particular actions. If it was the office of the PS that was responsible, we need to say that the PS office, State Department of Agriculture, Mr. James Muraguri, who was in office at that particular point, authorized this. It's not the office of the PS authorized. It's
Muraguri.
It's Muraguri. We need to have managerial responsibility tied to individuals, because it also then means the civil servants become a little bit more concerned by their names appearing, adversely being mentioned in those audit reports. And of course, that delay, for example, for those backlogs, is deliberate, like I mentioned, because the faster you move on those things, it means more resources have had to go to counties, and it's not been the interest of this particular government.
Right. Can I ask a sectoral question? Agriculture.
Yeah.
What do you think of the measures that the CS outlined in terms of course, the sector is struggling with high cost of inputs. He didn't address productivity, but he was trying to cushion the sector. Has he done enough, or is this more of a sweet narrative?
Literally, our agriculture, to talk about it, is over 60-70% is small scale holders, really, for sustenance farming. So when you hear measures by government with regards to agriculture and subsidies, for example, fertilizer and everything, you ask who's going to benefit from that fertilizers. It's not your ordinary thinking person who's getting targeted. It's actually the ranches, for example, those who are on 1,000 acres of land producing, because of course they have the ability to tilt the dynamics of markets, at the markets. What we need to think is ask ourselves, for example, the farmers, the small scale farmers, how do they get to benefit? And it's got nothing to do with the national government. In fact, things like the those fertilizer programs, national cereals, need to be abolished. Leave that work to the counties, because counties are more closer to the people. They know who has a farm, who doesn't have a farm.
Right.
Man, the guys in Nairobi only read the reports that come from the field. I might have a farm, 1,000 acres on the air, and I'm getting subsidy for fertilizers and then selling back to the market. And it's properly written GOK, not for sale. But then I just need to rebrand and get that. So we need to, and that's, we should, at that point where we should not be talking about agriculture subsidies at the national level. We need to see policy and regulatory comments coming from the National Treasury that we are pushing the State Department of Agriculture, if it's a food authority, an agriculture authority, asking about the quality of food that people are eating, and so that we are leaving counties to deal with those mechanics of subsidies and everything.
I think it's easy to throw hands up in the air and just say, this is a going down a rabbit hole here, and it's a difficult situation to get out of. But interestingly enough, the things you've said, James, I've not heard anything about any kind of external help necessary to solve the budget problems and implementation issues in Kenya. That the problems that we are seeing now, it's not for lack of revenue, it's not for lack of funding, it's not for lack of any of that would even need donor support or help. It's just a reorganization of priorities, and it is making sure that there's no duplicity of effort from national to county, for example, that you can actually handle things in a manner in which they ought to be handled budget-wise in country if priorities are fixed. Is that what we're saying?
Well, we have got, all those you mentioned, we don't have like a revenue problem and everything. But what we have is an expenditure problem. Counties, for example, are lagging with like 129 billion undisbursed to date. Why? Because also this government, really doesn't have money. Your priority is paying debt. So your planning and priorities are light according to what you think in the office, because our first obligation is to pay debt of the money, right? I looked this morning and I saw, I think for this coming financial year, around 57 billion in interest alone is going to China. And there's some 23 billion, on Eurobond, 57 billion or thereabout to Eurobond, and 23 billion to China for the SGR on interest alone, I think, if I'm not wrong. So come to think about it, then the implementation question comes, is we already approved. So they are following the script as approved, right? And so the challenge comes is that the conversation we need to have, and we, like you said, we have a lot of donor support. Like the EU is supporting reforms at the National Treasury, at the public service delivery, and looking, for example, at the timely transfers to counties. So when you think about timely transfers to counties, then you're asking is how much money did we collect that month? That month, what was our priorities? Our priorities were debt and stuff like that. But then asking, was that money available for disbursement? Customs.
Big question all the time. James, We thank you very much for joining us today. Come again soon. James Muraguri is the CEO of the Institute of Public Finance Kenya. He's a man who understands budget and budgeting and also understands what Ukur Yatani was talking about yesterday. Even bigger, he'll understand when the finance bill is taken to Parliament. So we'll call him to explain it to us. Tunapigwa tax wapi na wapi. James, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.